Hello and welcome to Nourish. My name is Kasia and I'm an entrepreneur, longtime meditator, and student of Chinese medicine. On this podcast, I share the stories and tools from type A high achievers who have discovered that elusive state of balance between success and interconnection, purpose, and awareness. Think yin and yang in flow. Because hustling without balance just leads to burnout. My hope is that this podcast offers you inspiration and tools to help you cultivate your best life. Now let's jump into it. Hello everyone, Kasia here. Welcome back to the Nourish podcast. I'm so excited to introduce my next guest to you all. On today's episode, I spoke with Janis Newman, who is a published author of a memoir and 2 award-winning novels. She is the founder of Lit Camp, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting writers, and she is a longtime meditator. Today, we talked about all things related to creativity. And big teaser, this podcast is for you regardless of if you consider yourself more of a professional former writer. We are digging into all things creativity, personal development, and really inner exploration through the process of writing. We talk about ways to cultivate that inner awareness through mindfulness and writing, how the two can work hand in hand. We talk a lot about cultivating creativity, and Janis actually shares a bit about her own creative journey, which I find personally inspiring. We talk about cultivating focus, how to break through blocks, creative blocks, and so much more. If you are an innovator, if you are somebody who wants to cultivate more creativity in your life, and of course, if you are a writer, this episode will deeply resonate for you. I'm so excited to jump into it. And without further ado, welcome Janis Newman to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
And I am so excited to have you. As I mentioned just before the call, I have quite a few friends who are fans of yours, who have made it to your nearly always sold out retreats. So I'm so excited to dive into all of the questions that we have prepared for this conversation today. But before we jump into that, I'm going to start with a nice and tough question. And that is, what are 3 words that you would use to describe yourself?
Okay. I know you sent this to me ahead of time and it said, describe yourself not related to your work. And that was such a good question because I hardly ever think of myself separate from my work, which I think maybe is typical of writers. So when I think of 3 words, I think they apply equally to my life and work since they're so intertwined. And I would say creative, I would say enthusiastic, and I would say innovative.
Ooh, I love those words. And it's so fascinating because I have to say, every single time I get on a call, and usually I meet a lot of the guests that I'm speaking with for the first time, face to face on this video call. And all of the words are just so different. And very frequently, they aren't even what I would expect the guest to say. And so I love to start with this question because a lot of how we perceive people, which largely is when we're reading their bios, what they've accomplished, how they introduce themselves, it's so focused around the things that they do. And that's why I just absolutely love to ask this question. And it's a good call out because I used to ask people to separate themselves from their work. And that's what I put in the outline. But a lot of the time, a lot of people actually mention that they feel like their work flows into their life. And so I don't want to keep that restriction there. So I like that you called it out because it is interesting how the two kind of meld together. And as you know, you have such an impressive bio, which I know I introduced at the top of this hour, but you're a published author of a memoir and 2 award-winning novels. You have a incredible nonprofit, Lit Camp, which is dedicated to supporting writers, and you're a longtime meditator. And then I know you host all of these retreats. And so it seems like you embody, in a way, a lot of your personality seems to be, from what we see you putting effort into the world, like it really shows up in the things that you're also creating. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you for calling that out. It's certainly how it feels on my end.
Well, that's the best. That's the best when that happens. So I want to actually start with one of the words that you mentioned that you would describe yourself as, which is creative. This creativity is a fascinating topic. I didn't even include it on the outline, but we're going to go there because you mentioned it. And it's something that there's a lot of research shows that creativity declines with age. There was some recent research out of Berkeley. A gentleman by the name of George Land had shared about, he had run a test with about 168 people over the course of their lives and different age groups. And there was just such a steep decline of creativity with age. And this is absolutely terrifying to me because, as human beings in the world living a joyful life, in many ways, I think creativity is one of the most important qualities that we cultivate. And so I love that you use this word to describe yourself. And so I want to ask, first of all, when you think of yourself as creative, like, what does that bring up for you? Is it that you're just having ideas all the time? Things just flow for you. You find yourself in a state of flow. Like, what is creativity for you? Let's start with that. And then I'd love to dive into how you cultivate it.
Okay. This is a great place to start. And I find this study you mentioned fascinating because I would say that has not proven true for me as I've aged. I feel like I am at least as creative, if not more. But I think it also,
yes.
yeah, so you can feel better. I think it also speaks to the idea that, you need to be stimulated. You need to have creative outlets. And I do think often as we get older in this culture, there are not enough outlets for you and you need to make them for yourself. I mean, as a novelist, and right now I'm in the middle of a first draft of a new book. Okay, my head is always full of characters, that I'm developing and creating, sort of out of thin air and working on those constantly. So it certainly is a factor in my writing life, but also I think in my other life, I mean, I feel like my creativity is always challenged when I'm thinking about, what can Lit Camp do for writers? Who can we bring to our conference? We recently opened a co-working space here in San Francisco. And so just how that would work and the model for that was a form of creativity. So I feel like it's in your life, but I also do think you need to cultivate it, or at least cultivate the situations that allow you to be creative.
Mm. Ooh, this is such a juicy, juicy topic. And I love that you mentioned this kind of notion of always being stimulated, because I feel like right now, and this is just my perception, so I'll just share it as it comes up for me, but stimulation for us comes in the form of consumption, like consumption of media, constantly having a place to be and things to do. And I don't know about you, but when I think about, and that's what I think of like stimulation. So I would love to explore like what are some other ways to think about stimulation. But for me, when I'm constantly stimulated, I actually am not creative at all. And like, that's why I was so excited by your workshop, which focuses on writing and mindfulness and kind of pulling these two together. So I would love to hear from you when you talk about kind of this notion of we need to be stimulated, or there might be this perception of we need to be stimulated to cultivate creativity. But to you, you mentioned that an outlet is so important. How does that show up in your life? Like, are you creating space? Are you putting yourself in new and exciting situations like rock music and opera? I don't know. I'm putting it out there, right?
I actually think, when I say that you need situations that foster your creativity, a huge part of that is just getting quiet, is because you can't hear your own imagination, and your imagination is there. And so you need this sort of time and space to be quiet. It's why I'm a huge believer in writing retreats, sort of removing yourself from your life to go and write. I'm also a big believer in writing first thing in the morning. And there is some science behind this. Apparently, when we first wake up, our brains are more able to make connections between things. And in my mind, that is very much the heart of creativity. So I always, when I'm working on a new book like now, I get up and before I do anything, before I look at email, before I think about my day, I sit down at the computer and do at least 10 minutes of free writing. Generally, it is, a character. Maybe I'm going deeper. Maybe there's a scene I'm having trouble with. I will often think before I go to bed what I'm going to write the next day. But it's always amazing to me. And there was a recent interview with Ruth Ozeki, who I like very much, and who is a wonderful writer and a Zen priest. And she said that when she's working on a book, she always works for at least an hour or two first thing in the morning. And she calls it a liminal space, which I really, really like.
What a beautiful term. When you write, and this is just a slight tangent, but I know people might be wondering this, do you typically type? Do you handwrite? Does it matter? Because I saw some research around the power of, in terms of like reprogramming your mind, if you're trying to reframe something for yourself, that there is a lot of power in kind of pen to paper. But I'm curious, does it matter for you? What are your thoughts on that?
I might be an outlier, but I hate writing by hand. Largely because I can't write as fast as I'm thinking.
Yes.
And, for me, the computer is, to be on my laptop is in my mind associated with novel writing. Yes, I send emails and do business on it, but the majority of my time is devoted to my creative writing. So that might be why I find that easier. But I have many students and also other writing friends who will do a first draft all by hand, and they really feel like it works. And of course, that's what Natalie Goldberg said, right? In writing down the bones, she was a huge advocate of, pen to paper.
Well, I think it's good to see that there are different ways of doing it and like whatever flows for you. For me, for example, the computer is associated with lots of stress, which maybe requires some reframing most of the time. And we can definitely dive into distractions because I think distractions, writer's block, just blocks in general, those are huge topics. But before we move into some of that, I want to talk about your thoughts on where ideas come from. And it's really fascinating because I think this notion of coming up with, let's even, it's great when you have the book idea and you're like, okay, this is the direction I'm going in. Writer's block is an all too common thing, but this kind of notion of blocks, I think it comes up for people in all different kinds of circumstances. And I'll just use myself as an example. I will say that I do write. I love journaling, but I do not consider myself a writer. But I am somebody who deeply values creativity. And it was at one point, especially when I was a kid, I felt like it was my superpower. So it's so exciting to have you say that your creativity has been cultivated and has even grown as you've gotten older. That's exciting to me. But one of the things that I struggle with is, something that used to come so easily to me, which is, okay, like new ideas I was bombarded with them. And when I'm heading in a specific direction, which in your case might be an analogy of like, okay, I'm writing this novel, it's this book, it's going in that direction. Maybe then the characters flow to you. But in those initial stages, when you're trying to figure out what are you going to write about, what do you do to kind of bring those ideas to the forefront? I know a lot of entrepreneurs are going to be like, okay, I'm trying to find my new thing. I know I want to do something new and different. Or even if you're developing a product within a company, let's say, or anything in that realm, how do those ideas come?
I think particularly for if you're going to write a book, which is, a years long process, you have to choose something that speaks to you. So I never go around thinking, oh, what's going to be my next idea? What happens is something comes to me. So for example, my first novel is a novel about Mary Todd Lincoln. And that idea came because I had taken my son to Ford's Theater for the tour. And then you go across the street to where Lincoln died. And they're telling this story and they're saying, yes, and Mary was by his bedside. And the Secretary of War came in and said, get that woman out of here. And when I heard that, I had this visceral reaction like, how dare you? Her husband is dying, which immediately made me want to know more about her. And I actually went looking for a novel about her, which at the time did not exist. So I ended up reading a biography and I got even more intrigued. And I thought, how could this woman have done all these like wacky things? She was a shopaholic. She probably had an affair in the White House. She was a spiritualist. And she was also really politically savvy and smart. And I realized I would not understand that unless I wrote a book from her point of view. So these things come to you that way. Similarly with my other projects, it was always something else I stumbled on and you feel it in your body. You feel like, I want to know more about this. I want to write this. I want to understand this. And so you do that. Many writers I know begin with an image. An image comes to mind that they just want to write. And so they go from there. But I think if you go and you're sort of, banging your head against the wall saying, where's my idea? It's not going to come. You're not really going to come up with something. So I guess I'm saying the world kind of presents the ideas to you and you find the ones that resonate with you.
So on that vein, right, there's this aspect, and we'll definitely dive into it, but there's kind of this element of looking inward, but also there's this element of like allowing the universe to almost like throw it in your face. And so let's say you're somebody who, and I think this can apply to books, but it can also apply to like any area of life. I find that like if I'm looking for an idea, I never find it, but I'll find ideas in all other realms. And maybe I'll even present you with like a real scenario, right? Trying to find a new idea in the digital health and wellness space, right? And it's crazy. I'm getting all these ideas for all these other random things that are completely unrelated. And so how would you advise someone to, if they're in this like seeking journey, how much of it is looking inward and seeing what comes up versus proactively finding new experiences? And is it new experiences? Is it, kind of putting out the intention of, you're seeking an idea in X space, or do you not even do that? And you just kind of go through this like stage of wandering, which is so difficult, by the way.
Yeah. I mean, I would actually recommend thinking about it first thing in the morning. Like the minute you open your eyes, think, yeah, I've been trying to figure this out and see what comes to you then, because I'm always surprised. Whenever I have some sort of plot problem I can't figure out, I just put it aside and wait till the morning. So I think it's a dual process. I mean, I think, yes, you expose yourself to a lot of things. You expose yourself to what's out there, either in your realm or something adjacent. And then you kind of just let it go. That's like the soil and you just let it go. And then you kind of mull it over. So that morning time is really good. I also, when I get really stuck, go take a walk without like listening to a podcast or anything, just a walk outside. And I think there's probably science behind this, but I don't know it. But I'm sure there's like a mind-body connection. Almost every writer I know, when you get really stuck, they just get up and like walk around the desk or make more tea. And it's amazing. The thing comes to you.
I love that. So speaking of podcasts, I know that I'm obviously a fan of podcasts, seeing as we are currently recording a podcast as well. And I love listening to them. But what are your thoughts on consumption versus creation? Because I think that ratio is really, really interesting. And do you kind of observe within yourself if that shifts in one direction or another, that it can change things for you? I'm curious.
Well, of course, as always, I think it depends on what you're consuming. If I'm sitting around, scrolling through Facebook, it's not really going to help anything that I'm doing. And I probably will not feel better when I get to the end. But, I listen to a lot of books. There'll be topics that I get very interested in. And one of the things that propelled me on the journey of this current book was I was listening to Jonathan Safran Foer's book, Eating Animals. And as I was listening to this book, I kept thinking that would make a great scene in a novel, or this would be great in a novel, or this sort of character would be great in a novel. And that began getting me thinking along these lines. So I would not have moved into this project without consuming something. When I worked on the Mary Todd Lincoln book, my personal reading through all that time, I only read books that were written in the mid 1800s or were set in the mid 1800s. And it was hugely, hugely helpful. So you can curate your consumption based on the project you're working on. My novel now is a polyphonic novel. It has multiple narrators. So I am now reading only polyphonic novels just to get a sense of them. And I think that that's really helpful to sort of make everything of a piece so that it fits in.
That's such a good recommendation. So it also, I think, starts to open up your eyes to what's out there if you're kind of in the space and experiencing it from different points of view. So speaking of this whole process, you mentioned, and I think it must have been on your website, or maybe I found it in a separate article, that your meditation practice has had a huge influence on your writing. Can you speak more to this and how that has been such a core influence for you?
Yeah. And it was surprising to me because it's certainly not why I took up meditation. But after I had been doing it consistently for a while, I began to notice a shift in my writing. I mean, some of it is very much on the surface. It's, my focus and concentration was better. And, there is proof of this that longtime meditators, meditation will literally change your brain for the better. And one of those changes is that it increases the part of the brain where you focus. So it just makes sense. I was able to focus in and do better. But there were other sort of, I think, more intangible things that happened. For one, I felt a lot like the descriptions of the world got more vivid. And I think that makes sense because along with the meditation, of course, was a lot of mindfulness practices. And as writers, it's our job to render the world on the page. But how do we do that if we're not paying attention to the world? So that I found just that increased mindfulness. It also helped me with characters because when you are present with other people, you're really listening to them and not thinking about what you're going to say next. You begin to have a deeper understanding of other people, which for a fiction writer is an important thing because we're always creating characters, always trying to put people who seem real on the page. So I found that really helped it as well. I would also say probably I did a lot of metta practice, loving kindness practice, and that helped me approach my characters with a sense of compassion I probably wouldn't have before, particularly your evil characters. It's always fun to write a bad guy. But unless you have some kind of compassion for this character, they're only going to be one dimensional. They're just going to be a bad guy. They will not be a complex person. So having compassion for the characters that you might not even want to meet in real life also deepens your writing. So those were some of the initial things I began to see coming out in my writing. There's also a body connection. Some of my meditation was body scanning. And I teach that a lot to writers now because so often their writing seems like eyeballs and brains moving through the world, their characters, and they don't have a body. And, writing from the body is really important. Like if I wrote, she picked up the teacup, it's a perfectly serviceable line. But if I write, she felt the warmth of the teacup in her fingertips, that brings you so much closer to the character and makes her more alive. So that's another thing you begin to develop, this mind-body connection and becoming aware of your own physical sensations.
That makes so much sense. And that awareness, I just love how you've translated how it shows up in the way that you can spread that awareness to the page so that your readers can really feel into the characters that are being created. Because that is such an interesting distinction, picking up the cup versus the feeling of it. And suddenly you're there with the character in the room, like experiencing that too. So from a very tangible point of view, what does your mindfulness practice and writing practice look like? Because I know that, and maybe actually you can share, it sounds like you have a very formal, disciplined novel writing practice. It sounds like you have some sort of discipline around your mindfulness practice. But I also know that you lead retreats that kind of interweave the two. And so do you also leverage writing as part of your mindfulness practice in addition to the formal writing discipline?
That's a good question. I mean, I do think there's so much overlap. My formal practice is pretty similar every day, 7 days a week. I get up kind of crazy early and I write.
Wait, how early are we talking? We need to share details here.
Like 5:30 or 6 in the morning.
Wow. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I go right to the writing first, which, in Zen is not typical. You typically meditate first. And Ruth Zeki says the same thing. She says she doesn't want to waste that important having just woken up time, that liminal space. So I will sit down at the computer and do at least 10 minutes, sometimes a little more writing. Then I go to the cushion. Then I meditate for about 20 minutes, something like that, just consistently every morning. What's great about the work I generate in that free writing in the morning is that later in the day, because I write, let's say after breakfast and I go to my co-working space, it's sort of my raw material, like a sculptor's clay. And I have that to start shaping when I'm there. So it's great. I never have to really face that blank page. I try periodically to do at least a day-long retreat. I did one this past Saturday where I go somewhere. I go to Green Gulch or some other retreat center, and you just have a day to be quiet and be disconnected from everything else. I think it's critical for your own creativity to have that. The writing retreats I do are very interwoven because we encourage, the people come with a project, they are working on that. If it's a very writerly retreat. And in between, we take breaks where I give them guided meditations meant to feed their writing. So it could be the body scan. One really great one is we do an emotion meditation where they call up an emotion, drop the story, and then just put it in their body. And, I ask them questions like, what's that emotion's texture or color or temperature? This is so helpful because writing emotion is a huge part of writing and also really hard to do it and not make it sound cliched, right? I mean, I'm always reading, his stomach dropped. And I'm thinking, okay, I've read that 1,000 times. It's not inaccurate, but it's been so overused. It doesn't mean anything. So that's one of the ways we intertwine them. And when I'm working with folks who do more journaling, who, do more writing for themselves, I sort of alter some of those. But the emotion one is really helpful because I ask them to call up a difficult emotion they're having, trouble dealing with. And, you describe it, you see it as its own thing, and then you make space around it. And that helps with their journaling because they can get a lot of that emotion down on paper and figure out what exactly they're feeling.
Yeah. And you recently hosted a workshop for writing and meditation for difficult times. Can you share a bit about kind of the themes? I unfortunately could not attend because it was sold out. I tried. I even called them. Okay. So can you share a bit about the themes and kind of what were some of the practices that you introduced during this workshop?
Yeah. This was a workshop that developed out of the pandemic. And for a while I was doing it online for nothing, just cause the pandemic. But I noticed early on during lockdown how my daily writing practice and my daily meditation practice sort of kept me sane. I mean, they really helped ground me. And I think that that is not surprising because, first of all, writing, if you're going to write about something, you need to take a step back from it, right? To see it, even if it's like a difficult time you had with somebody or something, you must take a step back. That distancing gives you some perspective on whatever it is you're writing about, and this is so key when you're writing about, if you're doing memoir or journaling about yourself, you have that step back so you can sort of look at the big picture. Meditation invites us to do the same thing. Some people think meditation is about stopping your thoughts, which will never happen because your brain is an organ that is meant to secrete thoughts. So you're not going to stop your thoughts. But what you are being invited to do is to observe them. And just like in writing, that observation, again, is a step back. You are much less identified with your story or the emotion you're feeling. You're taking that step back. So it goes hand in hand with the writing, with this ability to give us perspective and a little distance on what's going on so that we can better figure it out and learn the most skillful way to cope with it. So that's sort of the premise behind the writing of mindfulness for difficult times. We will do the emotion exercise I talked about, which was really important. The body scan is huge in that because we keep our trauma in our bodies and we disassociate from that. So even if you're not looking to write, but you just want to live as a human being, it's so important to be connected to what's going on with your body and what you're feeling in there, because it's not separate from your psychological or emotional state. We do the meta, and I ask folks we'd always do a exercise and then, in a meditation and then a writing exercise. And I ask them to, after the meta, and they have called up the difficult person that you do in that practice, I ask them to write a scene from the difficult person's point of view, which is a super interesting way to use writing to get at something.
Wow.
Yeah, people really like that one, and a lot of stuff comes up in there.
This is so powerful. I think this kind of experience of not just having the reflections, because the thoughts come up, but then it sounds like the writing kind of grounds it back down and allows you to really unpack the things that you have just observed come up in your body, in your mind. That is so, so, so powerful.
It is. And it's amazing to see it happen when you're in the workshop and you see what, people are dredging up and what they're releasing into the room. I mean, it's pretty incredible.
It's like a means of self-therapy in a way.
It is, because, I don't think you can have effective therapy unless you have at least some idea what's going on with you. You at least can recognize what the issue would be. And so often we don't even know that. We just know, oh, I'm not happy, or I can't do this.
Absolutely. And there's this element of also releasing those thoughts, but having them, that I think is so powerful. Because, by the way, I love therapy. Lori Schwambeck has been on here as a guest. She's my therapist, and it's, working with her has been so helpful. But there is also this aspect of, and I've started to become conscious of it, that when you release the things that are coming up, they just kind of go out into the ether because you're venting about it or you're talking to somebody about it. It's not the same as actually writing it out and kind of have a real-time processing of the experience. So that is so powerful.
I think they go hand in hand. I notice, when I'm doing a multi-day retreat, so the group, I work really hard to make sure everybody feels safe in the group. So they're writing it, but then they're also sharing it with the group. And I at Esalen, towards the end of the pandemic, I had 60 people in the group, which is way more than I usually have. But it was such a release. By the second day, people were sharing things. One of my students had been in Tiananmen Square when all of that happened. And she said, I have never talked to anybody about this. But first she wrote it. And then I think she felt like she was ready to tell people. And it's a lot about taking the story and sort of giving it to someone else so that they can help you carry it. So you don't have to carry it alone. So I've seen so much of that happen. It's really wonderful.
That is so powerful. And there's that element of vulnerability that comes up when you share something. And, I just had this realization as you were speaking. It's as though you're shining light, like the meditation brings it up. The writing allows you to shine a light on this part of yourself, maybe parts that you've never wanted to talk about or look at. And then sharing it out loud really releases that hold that it has over you.
Yeah, I'm going to steal that. That was so well put.
Yes, that is the sequence of your retreat. Take it, take it. that is so therapeutic because, the root of, if you look at all this incredible research coming out, you can't say everything, but a lot of the research that points to things like addiction, even all sorts of trauma, a lot of anxiety and depression, they're rooted in some sort of form of shame and the struggle of really like coming to terms with some of the difficult emotions that are living there, but also sharing them with the world. And so even getting it on paper has a releasing effect, but then to be able to share it with others in a safe space is so, so, so powerful.
Yeah.
Because it's like reinforces the acceptance, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think too, so many of the things we do when you talk about stimulation, we're just distracting ourselves from these things we don't want to face. And, that's never going to work. It's like when you meditate and you think, oh God, I want to stop thinking about that person or that thing. And you're trying to push it away. You're pretty much just making it stronger and it comes back versus, just welcoming it and saying, oh yeah, here I am ruminating on this again. But as soon as you think that, you have that space, right? Here I am doing this again. You are observing yourself.
Absolutely. So I do want to ask and potentially debunk a thought because you did share that there was a student in your class who had this really traumatic and intense experience. And as I mentioned, a friend of mine had participated in your workshop. I would love to participate. I don't consider myself a writer. And I know that the theme of what we're talking about here is writing, and you are a writer. Do you feel that everybody is a writer in some way, shape, or form? I know that there is like this notion of a professional writer, but when I hear of the term writer, I think that there is kind of an element of, oh, that's them, this is me. Like if you don't write professionally, that can almost be daunting. And I almost wish we had started with this for folks who are, thinking about this, this whole podcast episode with this theme of writing, and you're a writer. What are your thoughts on that? Like, does everybody have it in them?
I think everybody has the ability to use writing as a tool of creativity and self-expression. I think everybody has that. And so often when I do these retreats, there's always somebody who says, I don't know if I belong here. I'm not a writer. Like, it's okay. You could stay. Okay. By the end, they have usually written something that has blown me away. I'm always like, oh my God, who said you were not a writer? So I think, in any art form, as a human, we have this potential, which is a different thing than someone who decides to pursue writing on a more professional level, or someone like most of my writer friends who have decided to do that. We do it because we almost can't not do it. Okay. It's like none of us would be happy if we weren't writing. As hard as writing is, none of us would be happy. Okay. That is a different kind of writer than I think the general population. But I also think that our education sort of kills any creative writing, because when I've worked with kids in elementary school, oh my God, they write the most amazing stories. As I start to get into high school with students, okay, they're afraid to take a risk on the page, which only gets worse when you get older. Because everything you begin to learn is how to write an essay, write those college essays. And after that, it's, write a business proposal, write a business letter. These are all important forms of writing, but they are not creative. They are not you exploring your own creativity, which is why I like the morning writing. It was 2 years ago. I created an online platform called Creative Caffeine, where members sign up, and every day they get a prompt by email, and it's anything. It's often a line of poetry. and they write to it and they get a partner because that sharing is so important. So each week they have a new partner and they can just share their work on the app and then post it on the blog. But I would say most of the people on there do not identify as writers, but they write to those prompts every day. Sometimes they make stuff up. Most of the time they talk about their lives. I read all the stuff on the blog. It's incredible, the stuff they do. So I think we all have it, and we have to be reminded that it's okay. You are allowed to do that. I think we probably are all the same about painting too. It's like we're drawing something.
Yeah. It's amazing because humans are meant to express. I mean, if you look throughout history, look at the beautiful art forms that have come out. And I don't think that at the time necessarily people were thinking, oh, well, this is going to be in a museum one day. Like, this is going to be a element of history and like reflected as like this moment in history. People were just expressing themselves. And I think that's just such a incredible observation and point to be made, which is, and it's so crazy because I've talked about this in the past 3 days, like 3 times already, but the process as opposed to the product sometimes is just so important to look at.
Yeah, I'm going to say for writers, this is the most important thing. If you do not enjoy the writing of your book, then you should go do something else, because while it seems like publishing will solve all your problems and make you happy, it actually does not. It's a lot of ups and downs. It's almost never what you think it's going to be. I like it more than not publishing, but you really must find the pleasure in the process. So I know people who enjoy writing books, and I know every now and again I run into someone who wants to have written a book, but doesn't actually want to write it. And I think that's, there's no shame in that. Not everybody wants to tackle this, but I do think everybody would benefit from just a little free writing every day.
I'm going to extend that statement right there and say that I think it applies to not just writers, but probably most people, quite frankly. And I feel like I just had an epiphany myself because I'm an entrepreneur, but I spent many, many years in the corporate world climbing the ladder. And I really enjoyed the process of, at the time I was working in kind of in the product area for the longest time, which was actually a lot of creation of a lot of software. By the way, I'm an English major, so I'm a creative writer. I used to actually work in publishing while I was still in school. I thought I was going to be an editor, but I realized that I enjoyed the process of creating the magazine and figuring out like, okay, what are the themes? How are we going to get it to market? I actually created my own in high school and in college. I enjoyed that so much more than the actual act of writing. And this applies to, I think, also the general work world and a lot of the things that we do. We're so focused on the product and like, okay, I'm going to be X by the time I'm done with this. But if you're not enjoying the process, like that is your day-to-day life. And so I'm going to actually push on that and say it probably extends to most people, writers and product managers alike.
Yeah, I would agree with you there.
Yeah. So one last thing I did want to make sure we got into, because this is a huge topic for writers, but I think for a lot of folks, and that is creative blocks, navigating creative blocks. What do you do with that? I'm sure as a writer, you must have experienced writer's block at some point. Probably in your workshops, folks are talking about the same. How do you handle those blocks?
I'm not sure what exactly a writer's block is. I think we all hit times where it's hard to write. If I tend to write almost every day. If for some reason I'm on vacation or something comes up and I have a few days where I don't write, like let's say there's even a week, which is rare, but it's very hard to get back into it, which is why the morning free writes are so important. Because even if you're not going to write the rest of the day, you've got that 10 minutes where let's say if you're working on a book, you've touched the world of your book and you are still engaged. There are also times you're just sitting there and you think, I cannot write this person out of this room. It's like suddenly this is like impossible. And then I keep like a separate document that's my free writing. and I'll go in there and just free write it. And the beauty of free writing is you set the timer for like 10 minutes, and the goal is to keep your hands moving, even if you're writing, nonsense. And you don't go back. So if a sentence starts off one way and takes a sharp left turn, fine, I just follow it. But I have found that free writing is a really good way to avoid writer's block. A lot of writers I know, when they sit down to work, will do 10 minutes of free writing as a warm up on anything, And the thing is that you need to give yourself, you tell yourself two things. One, keep your hand moving. And two, nobody will see this. And that really loosens it up. I think that once you publish, you begin to think every word you put down is going to go out into the world. And that's really paralyzing. So you have to give yourself a lot of permission to write junk, to go down a blind alley, to do all those things, that everything that comes like out of your fingertips is not going to be, lyrical prose.
I love that perspective because, again, I think it goes back to focusing on the process as opposed to the product. And that a lot of that paralysis comes from, as you mentioned, feeling like, okay, there's this pressure. And I think this applies to writers. It applies to everybody who's going through any sort of a block, right? That paralysis, the procrastination that comes up when there's that emotion of usually some sort of like fear of failure, fear of shame. I mean, maybe I'm generalizing, but I just feel like I'm having a slight epiphany as we're talking about it, how it is that emotion that's getting in the way. So taking that action, it sounds like, in the form of free writing, just moving something forward is key.
Yes, it really is key. I'm going to say most writers I know have another outlet where they have a product at the end of the day. So when you're writing, you may have nothing at the end of the day. You might spend 3-4 hours and you might maybe have a scene, or maybe the next day you're going to redo it. And there is, I think, a human need to be productive, to accomplish something. So I know many writers who bake bread, make soup, who do other things so that they can say, okay, well, I have something to show for my efforts today. So we sort of find our way around that, because it's really a novel process. My last novel took 7 years. That is a long time to be in the process. And it had a lot of dead ends, and I felt blocked a lot of days, but you just keep with it. You definitely stick with it, and it comes out.
Beautifully said. Janis, I could keep speaking with you for hours, but we are coming up on time. So before we wrap, and I will link this all in the show notes as well, but where can people find you? What do you have coming up? Any exciting things that you can share with the audience?
Yeah, I have a website called writingmindfulness.com, and that has all of my upcoming retreats. So in January, I'll do one for Zen Center. It's online. It's like a 4-week online. But I'm super excited because in February, I'm co-teaching with a former student of mine who wrote a beautiful memoir. And then she's become a wellness expert and yoga teacher. So we're going to this silent monastery in Big Sur, and we've taken over most of it. And there'll be time to write, but then I'll be doing the guided meditations to feed the writing. She'll be doing wellness practices and gentle yoga to feed the writing. And at the end of the day, we always share what we've been working on. So I'm super excited about that in February. And then she and I go back to Esalen to teach a version of it. That'll be in March. They're all on my website. And I'm doing one also at Green Gulch Farm. And I think that one will come up, but it's all there. And that's, if you're interested in sort of this combination, those are the places to go and see that.
Amazing. And as I mentioned, I'll link everything below so folks can find you. It was such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you. It was wonderful questions. It's, sometimes you don't know what you think until someone asks you about it.
Absolutely. Well, curious is one of my words. I'll tell you that. So that kind of works out. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and see you next time. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Nourish. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider leaving a review or sharing it with a friend. Reviews really help this podcast grow and reach a larger audience, and I'm so grateful for that. I publish new episodes twice a month, so hit the subscribe button to be notified. See you next time.